By the winter of 1906, the immediate fires of the First Russian Revolution had largely burned themselves out. To the outside observer, it might have appeared that the Romanov dynasty had successfully weathered the storm. The general strikes that had paralyzed the empire were broken, the mutinous soldiers returning from the war with Japan had been disciplined, and Tsar Nicholas II sat once again securely on his throne. But the Russia that emerged from the chaos of 1905 was fundamentally different from the autocracy that had existed for the previous 3 centuries. Nicholas resented the concessions he had been forced to make to survive the uprising. The October Manifesto, which granted civil liberties and created a parliament known as the State Duma, was not a triumph of reform in his eyes. He viewed it as a humiliating capitulation. He regarded the new elected representatives as insolent enemies who had trespassed on his God-given right to rule alone. While the cities had quieted down, the countryside remained dangerous. Peasant uprisings continued to flicker across the provinces, and government officials lived in constant fear of assassination by anarchist bombs. In response to this new and hostile political reality, Nicholas withdrew. He retreated from the bustle and intrigue of St. Petersburg to the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, a quiet village 15 miles south of the capital. There, surrounded by manicured parkland and high iron fences, the imperial family turned inward. They focused intensely on their private lives, their religious devotion, and their children, effectively cutting themselves off from the harsh reality of the country they governed. This isolation created a dangerous vacuum at the heart of the Russian state. Over the next decade, the fate of the empire would largely fall into the hands of 2 men who stepped into this void to protect the throne. They were opposites in almost every conceivable way. One was a polished, Western-educated statesman, a prime minister who believed the monarchy could be saved only by ruthless modernization and the iron fist of the law. His name was Pyotr Stolypin, and his methods would become so infamous that the hangman's noose would soon be known across Russia simply as his necktie. The other man had no official rank, no formal education, and no respect for the law. He was a Siberian peasant, a wandering holy man who smelled of stale wine and unwashed clothes. Yet he would achieve a level of influence that generals and grand dukes could only dream of, simply because he held the key to the imperial family's most desperate secret. His name was Grigori Rasputin. For 10 years, between 1906 and 1916, these 2 figures would dominate the final act of the Romanov tragedy. One would try to force Russia into the 20th century with a program of reform and repression, while the other would inadvertently drag the reputation of the throne into the mud. This episode covers that strange, suspended decade where the empire had one final chance to save itself before the world went to war and the real revolution began. Part 1. The Necktie and the Wager. In the spring of 1906, the Russian Empire was effectively ungovernable. Although the major urban uprisings had been crushed, a wave of terror continued to sweep through the provinces. Government officials were being assassinated at a staggering rate, manor houses were burning, and the police seemed powerless to stop the chaos. In this atmosphere of near anarchy, Tsar Nicholas II turned to a man who had built a reputation for absolute fearlessness as the governor of the volatile Saratov province. Pyotr Stolypin was physically imposing. He was a large man with a thick black beard and an intense, commanding presence. During his time in Saratov, he became famous for walking directly into angry mobs of rioting peasants without a frantic security detail. On one occasion, while a revolutionary agitator pointed a gun directly at his chest, Stolypin calmly opened his coat and tossed it to the man, ordering him to hold it while the governor spoke to the crowd. The gunman, stunned by the display of authority, obeyed. It was this specific quality, an unshakable belief in his own authority and the divine right of the state, that Nicholas hoped would save the autocracy. Nicholas appointed Stolypin first as Minister of the Interior and, shortly after, as the Prime Minister. Stolypin arrived in St. Petersburg with a clear vision. He believed that the revolution was driven by 2 factors, the weakness of the government and the desperation of the peasantry. His solution was a dual policy that he pursued with relentless energy. He called it order and reform. History would remember it as the stick and the carrot. The stick came first. On August 25, 1906, the reality of the terrorist threat arrived at Stolypin's own doorstep. He was holding a reception at his dacha on Aptekarsky Island in St. Petersburg. Two revolutionaries, disguised in gendarme uniforms, entered the house carrying briefcases filled with explosives. When they were challenged by the guards, they threw the briefcases to the ground. The explosion was devastating. It demolished the front of the house and killed nearly 30 people instantly. Stolypin was knocked down by the blast, but suffered only minor injuries. His family was not so lucky. His 14-year-old daughter, Natalia, had her legs shattered, and his 3-year-old son was also wounded. The attempt on his life and the maiming of his children hardened Stolypin's resolve. He became convinced that normal legal procedures were insufficient to deal with men who threw bombs into crowded rooms. He utilized Article 87 of the Fundamental Laws, which allowed the government to issue emergency decrees when the Duma was not in session. Under this authority, Stolypin established a new system of field courts martial. The trials were extraordinary. The proceedings were held within 24 hours of a crime. The trial itself was secret, without a defense lawyer for the accused. If a death sentence was passed, it had to be carried out within 24 hours of the verdict. There were no appeals. The result was a wave of state-sanctioned violence that matched the terror of the revolutionaries. Over the next few years, thousands of people were executed by these courts. The hangman's noose became a ubiquitous symbol of the Prime Minister's administration. During a session of the Duma, a cadet deputy named Fyodor Rodichev lost his temper and referred to the gallows as Stolypin's necktie. The phrase stuck instantly, spreading across the country. Stolypin, who was present in the chamber, was so insulted that he immediately challenged Rodichev to a duel, which the terrified deputy avoided only by offering a profound public apology. But Stolypin knew that hanging revolutionaries was only a temporary solution. He understood something that the Tsar refused to accept. The monarchy could not survive if the vast majority of its subjects, the peasantry, had no stake in the system. For centuries, Russian peasants had lived in communes known as the Mir. In this system, the land was owned collectively by the village. A peasant family did not own the fields they worked. They were merely assigned strips of land to farm for a set period. These strips were periodically redistributed by the village elders to account for changes in family size. Stolypin viewed the commune as an economic disaster and a political breeding ground for socialism. Because the land was redistributed every few years, no peasant had any incentive to improve his plot, use fertilizer, or work harder than his neighbor, since he might lose that specific strip of land in the next redistribution. The system enforced poverty and collective resentment. Stolypin proposed a radical transformation of rural life. He wanted to dismantle the commune entirely. His legislation allowed individual peasants to withdraw from the village collective and claim their share of the land as private property. They could consolidate their scattered strips into a single farmstead, which they would own in perpetuity. Stolypin famously described this policy as a wager on the strong and sober. He wanted to create a new class of wealthy, independent farmers who owed their prosperity to their own hard work and the Tsar's reforms. He believed that if a man owned his own land, he would naturally become a conservative defender of property rights and the government. A man who owns his farm does not burn down the manor house of the local lord. This was a vision of a capitalist Russia, modernized from the ground up. To support this, the government offered cheap loans for peasants to buy land and sponsored massive resettlement programs to move land-hungry farmers from the overcrowded European provinces to the virgin lands of Siberia. Millions took him up on the offer. For a brief moment, it looked as though the plan might work. Grain production soared, and a new class of prosperous farmers began to emerge. However, Stolypin faced resistance from every direction. The revolutionaries hated him because his reforms threatened to remove the peasant anger that fueled their cause. The socialists knew that if the peasants became happy landowners, the revolution would die. But the most dangerous opposition came from the right. The traditional conservatives and the landed nobility felt threatened by Stolypin's ambition. They saw his reforms as an attack on the traditional Russian way of life. They whispered in the Tsar's ear that Stolypin was trying to overshadow the monarch, that he was becoming a grand vizier who held the real power in the empire. This conflict came to a head in his relationship with the State Duma. The first two Duma, elected after the 1905 revolution, were dominated by radicals and liberals who demanded massive land redistribution and limitations on the Tsar's power. Stolypin tried to work with them, but the deadlock was absolute. The deputies shouted him down, and he responded with icy disdain. When the Second Duma refused to cooperate, Stolypin dissolved it. But he went further. On June 3, 1907, he orchestrated what was effectively a constitutional coup. He illegally changed the electoral laws to drastically reduce the voting weight of the peasants and workers while increasing the representation of the nobility and the wealthy. The result was the Third Duma, often called the Lords' Duma. It was dominated by conservatives and moderates who were willing to work with the Prime Minister. It was in this chamber that Stolypin delivered his most famous speeches, his deep baritone voice filling the Tauride Palace. In response to radicals who demanded the dismantling of the Russian state, he delivered the line that would define his legacy. He told them, "You want great upheavals, but I want a great Russia." By 1911, however, Pyotr Stolypin was a man standing alone. His high-handed methods had alienated almost everyone. The left saw him as a butcher, the man of the necktie. The right saw him as a dangerous radical who was destroying traditional village life. Even the Tsar, the man Stolypin was fighting to save, had grown tired of him. Nicholas preferred ministers who were obedient and invisible, not dynamic statesmen who lectured him on policy. There were rumors in the capital that Stolypin was on the verge of being dismissed. He was exhausted, suffering from angina, and constantly aware that he was a target. He had written a will, expecting to be assassinated. In the end, Stolypin had succeeded in restoring order, but he had failed to secure the necessary political support to make his reforms permanent. He had gambled everything on the idea that he could force Russia to modernize through sheer will, bypassing both the democratic instincts of the liberals and the reactionary instincts of the court. As the summer of 1911 drew to a close, the Prime Minister was the most powerful man in the empire, and yet he was completely vulnerable. He travelled to Kiev in September for a celebration to unveil a monument to Alexander II, accompanying the Tsar. He did not know that the security services, the police force he oversaw, were about to fail him in the most catastrophic way possible. Part 2. Death at the Opera. In September 1911, Tsar Nicholas II travelled to Kiev to preside over a week of festivities. The occasion was the unveiling of a statue honouring his grandfather, Alexander II, the Tsar who had liberated the serfs. The city was decorated with flags and bunting, and the streets were lined with cheering crowds. Yet, behind the pageantry, the atmosphere was thick with paranoia. The secret police, known as the Okhrana, were on high alert. Rumors of a terrorist plot had been circulating for weeks, and the security services were desperate to prevent an embarrassment on the scale of the 1905 violence. Pyotr Stolypin accompanied the imperial party, but his diminished status was immediately visible to the court observers. Despite being the prime minister and the architect of the rigorous security state that protected the Tsar, Stolypin was treated with a cold indifference by the palace officials. While other ministers were provided with royal carriages, the Prime Minister was forced to hire a droshky, a common horse-drawn cab, to transport him around the city. The palace staff even attempted to deny him a room in the governor's mansion where the Tsar was staying. It was a public signal that the man who had crushed the revolution was no longer in favour. Stolypin seemed to sense that the end was near. Before leaving for Kiev, he had updated his will. He reportedly told a colleague that he expected to be killed by the very police force he was supposed to command. This fatalism was not unfounded. The security arrangements in Kiev were being managed by General Korlov and a local security chief named Lieutenant Colonel Kulyabko. These men were incompetent and eager to prove their worth to the Tsar, a dangerous combination that created the opening for a tragedy. The catalyst for the assassination was a 24-year-old man named Dmitry Bogrov. Bogrov was a figure of contradictions. He was the son of a wealthy Jewish lawyer and moved in high society circles, yet he was also an anarchist revolutionary. Crucially, he was a double agent. For years, he had been feeding information to the Okhrana about his revolutionary comrades, while simultaneously using his police connections to further the revolutionary cause. He was a man who played both sides, likely driven more by a desire for intellectual excitement and personal notoriety than by strict ideology. On September 13th, Bogrov approached Lieutenant Colonel Kulyabko with a terrifying tip. He claimed that a formidable assassin had arrived in Kiev with the specific intention of killing the Tsar. Bogrov invented a fictional name for this assassin, calling him Nikolai Yakovlev. He told the police that Yakovlev was hiding in the apartment of Bogrov's own father. He persuaded Kulyabko that the only way to catch the assassin was to allow Bogrov to shadow him. In a display of staggering negligence, the head of the Kiev security believed him. Kulyabko was so desperate to be the hero who saved the emperor that he suspended standard protocols. When Bogrov announced that the assassin might strike at the gala performance at the Kiev Opera House scheduled for the following night, Kulyabko made a fatal decision. He provided the double agent with a pass to enter the theatre. He did not verify Bogrov's story, nor did he place a guard on him. Most damning of all, he did not ensure that Bogrov was searched before entering the building. On the evening of September 14th, the Kiev Opera House was packed with the elite of Russian society. Generals, Grand Dukes, and government ministers filled the plush velvet seats. The heat inside the theatre was oppressive. The performance was Rimsky-Korsakov's The Tale of Tsar Sultan. In the imperial box, Tsar Nicholas sat with his two eldest daughters, the Grand Duchesses Olga and Tatiana. Stolypin was seated in the first row of the stalls, near the aisle. Security inside the auditorium was visibly lax. General Kurlov, who was technically responsible for the safety of the ministers, spent most of the evening consuming champagne in the buffet. During the intermissions, the aisle swarmed with high-ranking officials socializing and smoking. The opera reached its second intermission. The curtain fell, and the house lights came up. The temperature in the hall had risen, and many guests moved toward the exits to find fresh air. Stolypin stood up from his seat. He was dressed in a white tunic with a sash. He moved toward the orchestra pit and leaned his back against the brass railing, facing the audience. He began a casual conversation with Count Fredericks, the minister of the imperial court. Stolypin was relaxed, holding his helmet in his hand. He was not wearing a bulletproof vest, an item he had frequently worn in previous years but had discarded on this trip, perhaps due to the heat or his fatalistic mood. Dmitry Bogrov was also in the auditorium. He was dressed in evening tails, blending in perfectly with the aristocratic crowd. He'd been sitting in the 18th row. As the intermission began, he stood up and began to make his way down the aisle toward the orchestra pit. Because he was a police informant with a valid ticket, no one stopped him. He walked with a steady, purposeful pace. As Bogrov reached the front of the stalls, he turned toward the Prime Minister. Stolypin noticed the young man approaching, but did not appear alarmed. He likely assumed it was a petitioner or a junior official bringing a message. When Bogrov was only 2 or 3 paces away, he reached into his pocket and drew a Browning semi-automatic pistol. The sound of the first shot was muffled by the chatter of the crowd and the acoustics of the hall. Many people later recalled thinking that an opera glass had fallen from one of the upper balconies. But then came a second shot, followed instantly by a woman's scream. One bullet pierced Stolypin's hand, the one holding his helmet. The second bullet struck him in the chest. In a stroke of terrible irony, the bullet hit the cross of St. Vladimir that was pinned to his tunic. The hard metal of the medal deflected it. The projectile shattered, tearing into his liver and lodging against his spine. The scene that followed was frozen in the memories of everyone present. Stolypin remained standing. He clutched the railing of the orchestra pit to steady himself. His face went pale, but he remained standing. He looked down at his white tunic, which was rapidly turning red. With a slow, deliberate movement, he looked up toward the imperial box where the Tsar was standing, watching in horror. Stolypin raised his trembling hand and made the sign of the cross in the air, blessing the emperor. It was a final, theatrical gesture of loyalty from the man who had dedicated his life to the monarchy. Only after completing the sign of the cross did his legs give way. He collapsed into his seat, saying clearly, "I am happy to die for the Tsar." Pandemonium erupted in the theatre. Bogrov attempted to run back up the aisle to escape, but the crowd descended on him. Army officers drew their sabers and began to hack at the assassin. The audience, seized by a mob fury, kicked and punched him. He would likely have been beaten to death on the spot had the police not finally intervened, dragging the bloodied assassin away to secure him for interrogation. The Tsar remained in his box. As the shock wore off, the entire audience turned toward him. Spontaneously, they sank to their knees. The national anthem, God Save the Tsar, rose from the crowd, sung with a fervent, desperate intensity. Nicholas stood at the front of the box, bowing to his subjects, while doctors rushed to the stalls to attend to his dying prime minister. Stolypin was carried out of the theatre and taken to a nearby clinic. For several days, he lingered between life and death. The bullet had caused catastrophic internal damage, and infection set in quickly. Throughout his agony, he remained lucid, asking about the Tsar's safety and the state of the government. However, the reaction of the court to the tragedy was chilling. Nicholas visited the clinic once, briefly. He seemed uncomfortable and eager to leave. In a letter to his mother, the Dowager Empress Marie, Nicholas described the event with a strange detachment, focusing more on the view from his box than on the loss of his statesman. He wrote about how Stolypin had turned toward him and blessed him, almost as if he were reviewing a performance. As Stolypin lay dying, the police investigation began to uncover the depth of the security failure. It became clear that Kulyabko and Korlov had been criminally negligent. Yet, rumors began to swirl immediately that this was more than simple incompetence. Many in the capital believed that the reactionary clique around the throne, who hated Stolypin's reforms, had allowed the assassination to happen. They pointed to the fact that Bogrov, a known revolutionary, had been given free access to the theatre by the secret police. Pyotr Stolypin died on the evening of September 18, 1911. His death marked a decisive turning point for the Russian Empire. He was the last man who possessed the vision, the strength, and the ruthlessness to hold the crumbling system together. With his passing, the path to reform was closed. The Tsar halted the investigation into the police negligence, supposedly to avoid a public scandal during a time of mourning, but the decision only fueled the belief that the court had wanted Stolypin gone. The Prime Minister was buried in the Kiev Pechesk Lavra monastery. The Tsar left the city before the funeral took place, continuing his vacation in the Crimea. The message was clear. The era of the strongman was over. The government drifted back into a state of passive drift, overseen by a monarch who believed that his rule was guided by divine providence rather than political skill. And into this vacuum stepped the only person who offered the Tsar the certainty he craved, not a minister, but a mystic. Part 3. The Secret of Spala. While the Russian Empire was publicly grieving the death of Pyotr Stolypin, the imperial family was privately wrestling with a crisis that they believed threatened the existence of the dynasty. For years, the Tsar and his wife had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide a terrifying secret from their subjects. It was a secret that explained their isolation, their erratic behavior, and their eventual reliance on a Siberian peasant who would help destroy them. The secret was the health of the heir to the throne, Tsarevich Alexei. Born in 1904, Alexei was the fifth child and the only son of Nicholas and Alexandra. After 4 daughters, his birth was greeted with cannon salutes and church bells across the empire. He was the proof of God's favor, the guarantee that the Romanov line would continue. But within weeks of his birth, the parents noticed that when the baby was bumped or bruised, the bleeding did not stop. Dark, swollen lumps would appear under his skin, and he would cry in agony for hours. The doctors confirmed the worst fear of the empress. Alexei had hemophilia. At the time, it was known as the royal disease, a genetic disorder passed down through the royal houses of Europe by Queen Victoria, Alexandra's grandmother. The condition prevents the blood from clotting. In the early 20th century, there was no treatment and no cure. A minor fall, a nosebleed, or a cut on the finger could be fatal. Even worse were the internal hemorrhages. If a blood vessel ruptured inside a joint or muscle, the blood would flow into the closed space, causing pressure and excruciating pain that could last for weeks, often leaving the limb permanently damaged. For Empress Alexandra, the diagnosis was a psychological catastrophe. As a carrier of the gene, she knew that she was biologically responsible for her son's suffering. She was a woman already prone to neurotic anxiety, and this guilt consumed her. She became obsessed with the boy's safety. She appointed 2 sailors from the Imperial Navy, Derevenko and Nagorny, to watch him every second of the day. They carried him upstairs and stood guard while he played. The family withdrew from court society to hide the boy's condition, fearing that if the public knew the future Tsar was an invalid, the monarchy would lose its legitimacy. Traditional medicine had failed her. The court doctors could offer nothing but aspirin and bed rest. In her desperation, Alexandra turned to religion and then to mysticism. She believed that if science could not save her son, perhaps faith could. It was through this door that Grigori Rasputin walked into the devastation of the imperial home. Rasputin was introduced to the family in 1905 by the Grand Duchesses Milika and Anastasia, 2 sisters from Montenegro who were heavily involved in the occult circles of St. Petersburg. Rasputin was a starets, a wandering holy man. He belonged to no religious order. He was a peasant from the village of Pokrovskoye in Siberia. He was dirty, unkempt, and rumors of his sexual debauchery followed him everywhere. But when he stood before the Empress, he offered her the one thing no one else could: absolute certainty. He told her that her son would live and that God had sent him to protect the boy. The pivotal moment that cemented Rasputin's hold over the Empress and, by extension, the Russian government occurred in October 1912. The family was staying at a hunting lodge in Spala, a remote forest retreat in Russian-occupied Poland. It was a dark, damp structure, isolated from the capital and the telegraph networks. The crisis began with a simple carriage ride. As the family was traveling through the bumpy forest roads, the carriage jolted violently. Alexei, who was 8 years old at the time, was thrown against the side of the vehicle. He complained of a pain in his upper leg, but initially it seemed minor. However, the jolt had ruptured a blood vessel deep inside his abdomen, likely in the psoas muscle near the groin. Over the next few days, the internal bleeding accelerated. A massive hematoma formed, swelling to the size of a grapefruit. The pressure on the nerves was agonizing. The boy's left leg was drawn up against his chest, and he could not straighten it. The pain was so intense that the heir to the Russian throne began to scream. The situation at the hunting lodge turned into a nightmare. For 11 days and nights, the screaming did not stop. It was a high, thin wail of pure agony. The walls of the wooden lodge were thin, and the sound penetrated every room. The servants and courtiers walked around with cotton wool stuffed in their ears to block out the noise. Outside, the rain poured down relentlessly, turning the forest tracks into mud and furthering the sense of hopelessness. The Tsar and Empress took turns sitting by the bedside. Nicholas, usually so reserved, wept openly. Alexandra aged years in a matter of days. Her hair turned grey, and her face became a mask of grief. She held the boy's hand as he begged her to help him. At one point, the pain was so great that the 8-year-old child asked his mother to bury him in the forest because he wanted to die. The court physicians, Dr. Eugene Botkin and the surgeon Dr. Fedorov, were powerless. They monitored the boy's pulse and temperature, but they could do nothing to stop the internal bleeding. They discussed attempting to drain the hematoma surgically, but they knew that the incision itself would likely cause him to bleed to death. By the second week of the crisis, the boy's temperature spiked to 105 degrees. His pulse was weak and thready. He began to drift in and out of consciousness. The doctors informed the Tsar that the end was near. They drafted an official medical bulletin announcing the inevitable death of the Tsarevich, leaving the date blank to be released to the press the moment he stopped breathing. The last rites were administered. The family gathered to say goodbye. In this moment of absolute despair, with the doctors admitting defeat, Alexandra played her final card. On October 12th, she sent a telegram to Siberia. Grigori Rasputin had been banished from the capital due to scandals regarding his behavior, and he was currently in his home village of Pokrovskoye. The message was brief, begging him to pray for the boy. Rasputin received the telegram and immediately went into his private chapel. He prayed for some time, reportedly falling into a trance. He then went to the local telegraph office and sent a reply that would change the course of history. The telegram read, "God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much." The telegram arrived at Spala on the morning of October 13th. Alexandra seized upon it with the ferocity of a drowning woman. She showed it to the doctors and the Tsar, declaring that the crisis was over because the man of God had spoken. Almost immediately, the bleeding stopped. Within hours of the telegram's arrival, the boy's temperature dropped. The swelling began to recede. The excruciating pain faded, and for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, Alexei fell into a deep, natural sleep. The doctors were stunned. They could offer no medical explanation for the sudden reversal. From a scientific perspective, it is possible that the hematoma had simply reached its maximum pressure and naturally began to reabsorb. It is also possible that Rasputin's instruction to not allow the doctors to bother him saved the boy. The doctors had been constantly prodding the injury to check its size and administering aspirin, which is a blood thinner. By stopping the aspirin and leaving the boy alone, the clotting process may have finally been able to work. But to Empress Alexandra, the mechanism did not matter. She was not interested in medical hypotheses. She had seen the evidence with her own eyes. The best doctors in Europe had failed her, and a peasant in Siberia had saved her son with a prayer. From that day forward, Alexandra's belief in Rasputin was unshakable. He was more than just a spiritual advisor, he was a necessity. She believed that he was literally the only thing standing between her son and death. Any attack on Rasputin was viewed by the Empress as an attack on her child's life. When politicians, generals, or even her own relatives tried to warn her about Rasputin's drunken behavior or his scandalous affairs, she refused to listen. She dismissed the police reports detailing his debauchery as the work of the devil, testing her faith. This created a dangerous dynamic. Rasputin realized the extent of his power. He knew that as long as the Empress believed he kept the boy alive, he was untouchable. He returned to St. Petersburg with a new arrogance. He began to accept bribes from people who wanted access to the Tsar. He held court in his apartment, surrounded by a group of female admirers who hung on his every word. The secret of Spala remained within the family. The Russian people did not know that the heir was a hemophiliac. They saw only the result, a Tsar and Tsarina who seemed to be under the hypnotic spell of a dirty, illiterate peasant. Without the context of the boy's illness, the relationship was inexplicable. Rumors began to spread through the gutters of Petrograd. They whispered that Rasputin was the Empress's lover. They called him the Holy Devil. They said that the Tsar was a cuckold and a weakling who was being controlled by his German wife and her dark master. The tragedy of the Romanovs was locked in place at Spala. The parents' love for their son had created a trap. To save the boy, they had to embrace the one man who would ruin their reputation. As the empire drifted toward war in 1914, the Tsar was physically on the throne, but psychologically, the imperial couple was living in a different world, a world defined by the terror of a bleeding child and the shadow of the man who claimed to save him. Part 4. The Political Decay. In August 1914, the Russian Empire entered the First World War on a wave of genuine patriotic fervor. The strikes that had plagued the cities vanished overnight. Workers and students marched to the Winter Palace, falling to their knees to sing the national anthem. For a brief, intoxicating moment, the Tsar was once again the beloved father of his people. The political divisions that had festered since the death of Stolypin seemed to evaporate in the face of a common enemy. But the unity was an illusion, and modern warfare proved to be a cruel test for the antiquated Russian state. By the summer of 1915, the army was in full retreat. They had lost Poland and Lithuania to the German advance. The soldiers were fighting without boots, without maps, and, most criminally, without ammunition. In some sectors, Russian artillery was limited to firing 3 shells per day, while the German batteries rained thousands down upon them. In this atmosphere of military catastrophe, Nicholas II made the most fatal decision of his reign. Against the advice of 10 of his 12 ministers, he decided to dismiss his uncle, Grand Duke Nicholas, and take personal command of the army. He announced that it was his duty as Tsar to be with his troops in their time of suffering. On August 23, 1915, Nicholas left the capital for the military headquarters at Mogilev, 500 miles away. By doing so, he abandoned the political center of gravity. He left the day-to-day running of the government in Petrograd to his wife, Empress Alexandra. And effectively, he handed the governance of the Russian Empire to Grigori Rasputin. The period that followed, from September 1915 to December 1916, became known in Russian history as the Ministerial Leapfrog. It was a time of administrative chaos so profound that it managed to alienate the people who were most loyal to the monarchy: the aristocracy, the conservatives, and the military elite. With the Tsar away at the front, appointments to the highest offices in the land were no longer decided by competence or political necessity. They were decided by a simple litmus test. Did the candidate accept or reject the holy man? Alexandra, isolated at the Alexander Palace and terrified for her son's health, viewed every politician through the lens of her loyalty to Rasputin. If a minister criticized him, she saw it as an attack on her family and God. She would write frantic letters to her husband at headquarters demanding the man's dismissal. Nicholas, exhausted by the war and hating confrontation, almost always acquiesced. The statistics of this period are staggering. In just 16 months, Russia saw 4 prime ministers, 5 ministers of the interior, 3 foreign ministers, 3 war ministers, and 3 ministers of justice. No government could function with this level of turnover. Every time a new minister arrived, the bureaucracy would freeze, waiting to see what the new policy would be. By the time work resumed, the minister would be fired and replaced by another. The quality of the men appointed during this time plummeted. Competent technocrats were purged and replaced by sycophants, careerists, and mystics who were willing to flatter Rasputin to gain power. The most notorious example was the appointment of Boris Sturma as Prime Minister in January 1916. Sturma was an elderly, reactive bureaucrat with a reputation for dishonesty. He had no experience in high office and no support in the Duma. His only qualification was that he was a friend of Rasputin and obsequious to the Empress. At a time when Russia was fighting a war for national survival against Germany, placing a man with the German surname of Sturma at the head of the government was a public relations disaster. It fueled the dark rumors already circulating in the breadlines that the Empress and her clique were secretly working for the Kaiser. Even worse was the appointment of Alexander Protopopov as the Minister of the Interior. This was the most powerful cabinet position in Russia, responsible for the police, the provincial governors, and, crucially, the food supply of the capital. Protopopov was widely regarded by his contemporaries as mentally unstable. He was a regular attendee of seances and reportedly suffered from advanced syphilis. He had met Rasputin at a healing session and had completely fallen under his spell. When he was appointed in late 1916, the establishment was aghast. The Tsar's own sister, Grand Duchess Xenia, wrote in her diary that the appointment was an act of madness. Rasputin's began to offer advice on military strategy and food logistics, claiming that his insights came to him in dreams. Alexandra would faithfully transcribe these visions and send them to the Tsar. In her letters, she urged Nicholas to comb his hair with Rasputin's comb before meeting his generals, believing it would give him divine wisdom. She demanded that he launch offensives or halt attacks based on the timing of religious holidays rather than strategic necessity. While Nicholas did not always follow this military advice, the mere fact that the Empress was transmitting it caused irreparable damage. The contents of these letters were not as secret as the imperial couple believed. German intelligence and indeed the chatter of St. Petersburg society knew that the chain of command now ran through the Siberian peasant. The atmosphere in the capital turned toxic. The aristocracy watched in horror as their world collapsed from within. It was no longer just the radical socialists calling for the overthrow of the regime. The Grand Dukes, the cousins and uncles of the Tsar, began to openly discuss the need to remove Alexandra from power. They referred to the situation as the reign of the dark forces. Vladimir Purishkevich, a far-right monarchist politician who had once been a staunch supporter of the autocracy, delivered a thundering speech in the Duma in November 1916. He stood before the assembly and shouted that the Tsar's ministers had been turned into marionettes, stripped of their will by the evil genius of Rasputin. He famously declared that it was an obscenity that the destiny of Russia was being decided by a dirty peasant. The speech was a sensation. It was printed and distributed illegally, read by soldiers in the trenches and workers in the factories. It confirmed what everyone already suspected: the government was broken. The food shortages in the cities were worsening because the transport system had collapsed under the chaotic management of incompetent ministers. By December 1916, the sense of impending doom was palpable. The French ambassador, Maurice Paléologue, wrote in his diary that the air was thick with the anticipation of tragedy. The Tsar remained at the front, refusing to return to the capital, paralyzed by his fatalistic belief that everything was in God's hands. He ignored the desperate telegrams from the president of the Duma, Mikhail Rodzianko, warning him that the country was on the brink of revolution. The imperial family had successfully isolated themselves from their people, their government, and reality. They believed that as long as Rasputin was near, they were safe. But they had underestimated the desperation of the Russian elite. If the Tsar would not act to save the monarchy from the holy devil, then the monarchists would have to do it for him. The stage was set for the final, bloody act of the year, one that would take place in the basement of the wealthiest palace in St. Petersburg. Part 5. The Night at the Moika. By December 1916, the Russian capital was a city waiting for an explosion. The political paralysis was total, and the hatred for the Empress and her advisor had reached a fever pitch. In the salons of St. Petersburg, the aristocracy no longer whispered about the need to remove Grigori Rasputin. They spoke of it openly. The belief was widespread that if the dark force could be eliminated, the Tsar would wake from his stupor, the Empress would be sidelined, and the monarchy could be saved. The conspiracy that finally coalesced was led by a man who represented the pinnacle of the Russian elite. Prince Felix Yusupov was 29 years old and the sole heir to the largest private fortune in the Russian Empire. The Yusupov family was wealthier than the Romanovs themselves. They owned 4 palaces in the capital alone, along with vast estates, mines, and factories across the country. Felix was a flamboyant, eccentric figure, educated at Oxford University and married to the Tsar's niece, Princess Elena. He recruited a small circle of accomplices who provided the necessary political and social cover. The most important was Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's first cousin and a favorite of the imperial family. His presence ensured that if the police caught them, the conspirators could not be immediately arrested, as members of the imperial blood were immune to civil law. The third key member was Vladimir Purishkevich, the far-right politician who had delivered the famous speech in the Duma denouncing Rasputin. He provided the link to the political establishment. The plan was set for the night of December 16, 1916. Yusupov decided to lure Rasputin to his family's residence, the Moika Palace, a massive yellow colonnaded building on the banks of the Moika River. The bait was Felix's wife, Princess Irina. Rasputin had long expressed a desire to meet the beautiful young princess. Yusupov lied to the holy man, telling him that Irina was in the city and wished to entertain him privately that evening. In reality, Irina was miles away in the Crimea. The murder was to take place in a basement room of the palace, which Yusupov had specially furnished for the occasion. He had the room renovated to look like a cozy dining area, with rugs, antique furniture, and a fire burning in the grate. He wanted the setting to be intimate and disarming. Earlier that evening, the conspirators prepared the lethal components of the evening. A doctor named Stanislaus Lazover, who was serving as the driver for the group, prepared potassium cyanide crystals. According to Yusupov's later testimony, the doctor crushed the crystals and sprinkled the powder into several pink petite fours, creamy cakes that Rasputin was known to love. They also prepared glasses of Madeira wine laced with the poison. The dose was reportedly massive, enough to kill several men instantly. Yusupov drove to Rasputin's apartment around midnight to pick him up. The monk was dressed in his finest silk shirt and velvet trousers, smelling of cheap soap and anticipation. They drove back to the Moika Palace in silence. When they arrived, Yusupov led Rasputin down the spiral staircase to the basement. The gramophone was playing Yankee Doodle on a loop. A detail Yusupov noted added a bizarre, manic soundtrack to the events. Yusupov explained that his wife was currently entertaining other guests upstairs, but would join them shortly. He invited Rasputin to eat and drink while they waited. What happened next is drawn primarily from Yusupov's own memoirs, which are dramatic and self-aggrandizing, but they provide the only detailed account of the room that night. According to the prince, Rasputin initially refused the food, but eventually accepted the poisoned cakes. He ate one, then another. Yusupov watched, terrified, waiting for the man to collapse. Nothing happened. Rasputin continued to talk, asking about the princess and the music. He showed no signs of distress. Panicked, Yusupov offered him the poisoned wine. Rasputin drank one glass, then asked for another. The poison, which should have stopped his heart in minutes, seemed to have no effect whatsoever. Modern toxicologists have speculated on why this happened. It is possible the cyanide was old and had lost its potency. It is possible that the sugar in the cakes and the wine neutralized the chemical reaction. Or, perhaps, Dr. Tokte. Lazarevich had lost his nerve at the last moment and substituted a harmless powder for the poison. Whatever the scientific reason, the result for Yusupov was a psychological nightmare. He was trapped in a basement with a man he believed was the Antichrist, a man who apparently could not be killed by mortal means. Around 2:30 in the morning, Yusupov excused himself and ran upstairs to the study where Grand Duke Dmitri and Purishkevich were waiting. He was pale and shaking. He told them the poison had failed. The conspirators briefly discussed abandoning the plan, but Purishkevich was adamant. The deed had to be done. Yusupov took Grand Duke Dmitri's Browning revolver and returned to the basement. Rasputin was sitting at the table, breathing heavily, perhaps feeling the effects of the alcohol, but very much alive. He asked Yusupov to play the guitar. Yusupov walked to a crystal crucifix that was sitting on a cabinet. He picked it up and told Rasputin, "Grigori Efimovich, you had better look at the crucifix and say a prayer." Rasputin looked at him with a confused expression. He stood up and moved closer. Yusupov raised the revolver and fired a single shot into Rasputin's chest. The monk let out a roar and collapsed backward onto the white bearskin rug. Hearing the shot, the other conspirators rushed down the stairs. They examined the body. There was a bullet hole near the heart. The doctor checked for a pulse and declared him dead. The tension broke. The men embraced, believing they had just saved Russia. They turned off the lights and went back upstairs to prepare for the disposal of the body. However, the night was not over. About an hour later, Yusupov felt a strange urge to check the corpse again. He returned to the darkened basement alone. He leaned over the body on the rug. The monk was motionless. Yusupov shook him. Suddenly, Rasputin's left eye twitched open, then the right. As Yusupov stared in horror, the dead man sat up. He grabbed Yusupov by the throat with immense strength, ripping the epaulette from his shoulder. Yusupov screamed and struggled to break free, tearing himself away from the gripping hands. Rasputin scrambled to his feet. He ran toward the side door that led out into the courtyard, shouting that he would tell the Empress everything. Yusupov ran upstairs, screaming to Purishkevich that the monk was still alive. Purishkevich grabbed his own pistol and ran out into the snowy courtyard. He saw Rasputin staggering through the deep snow toward the iron gates that led to the street. Purishkevich fired twice and missed. He steadied his hand, bit his lip to focus, and fired a third time. The bullet hit Rasputin in the back. The monk halted. Purishkevich fired a fourth shot, which struck him in the head. Rasputin fell into the snow. Purishkevich ran over and kicked the body in the temple to ensure he was finished. The noise of the shooting had alerted a policeman on duty nearby. The conspirators had to act quickly. They dragged the body back inside the palace vestibule. In the chaos, they beat the corpse with a rubber truncheon, venting their fear and adrenaline. They then wrapped the body in a heavy curtain and bound it with rope. Grand Duke Dmitri brought his car around. They loaded the bundle into the back and drove toward the Petrovsky Bridge. The plan was to dump the body into the Little Nevka River. It was a clumsy operation. When they arrived at the bridge, they forgot to attach the heavy chains they had brought to weigh down the body. They simply threw the corpse over the railing into a hole in the ice. In their haste, they left one of Rasputin's galoshes, his rubber overshoes, sitting on the bridge piling, a glaring piece of evidence. The cover-up began to unravel almost immediately. The policeman who had heard the shots knocked on the door of the Moika Palace. Purishkevich, in a moment of drunken bravado, had reportedly told the officer, "I have killed Rasputin, the enemy of Russia and the Tsar." He then urged the policeman to keep it a secret. Naturally, the policeman reported this to his superiors the next morning. By the afternoon of December 17th, the entire city knew that Rasputin had vanished. A trail of blood was found in the courtyard of the Moika Palace. The galosh was found on the bridge. Divers were sent into the freezing river. On December 19th, 3 days after the murder, the police found the body. The cold water had preserved it perfectly. Rasputin's arms were raised upward, as if he had tried to claw at the ice from below. This detail gave birth to the final myth of the holy devil, that he was still alive when he hit the water and had ultimately died of drowning. However, the official autopsy, which was kept secret for years, contradicts this. It stated that there was no water in the lungs. Rasputin had died from the 3 gunshot wounds, one to the chest, one to the back, and the fatal shot to the forehead. The raised arms were likely a result of rigor mortis setting in while the body was being transported in the trunk of the car, or due to the current of the river. The reaction to the murder was immediate and polarized. In the streets of Petrograd, people rejoiced. Strangers kissed each other in public. In the theatres, audiences demanded the national anthem be played. The Grand Dukes and the aristocracy drank toasts to Yusupov and Dmitri. They believed the spell had been broken. But at the Alexander Palace, the reaction was one of utter devastation. Empress Alexandra was crushed. She demanded that the conspirators be executed. However, because Dmitri was a Romanov, the Tsar could not bring himself to order a trial. Instead, he exiled both men. Grand Duke Dmitri was sent to the Persian front, and Yusupov was banished to his country estate. Ironically, this exile would save their lives. Because they were sent away from the capital, they would both escape the Bolshevik execution squads that would claim so many of their relatives a year later. Nicholas returned from the military headquarters to comfort his wife. They buried Rasputin in a quiet corner of the imperial park at Tsarskoye Selo. The empress placed an icon on his chest, signed by her and her daughters. She was convinced that without his prayers, the family was doomed. Rasputin himself had predicted this. He had written a final letter to the Tsar, stating that if he was killed by common peasants, the Tsar's throne would be safe. But if he was killed by the Tsar's relations, by the nobility, then the Tsar and his family would be killed within 2 years. As 1916 turned into 1917, the euphoria over the murder began to fade. The aristocracy realized with horror that nothing had actually changed. Rasputin was dead, but the trains were still not running. The bread lines in Petrograd were getting longer. The soldiers at the front were still freezing and dying. The incompetence of the government was not due to magic spells or German spies. It was due to a systemic collapse that had been decades in the making. The murder of Rasputin was the last gasp of the old regime. It was an attempt to solve a political problem with a medieval solution. By killing the favorite, the Grand Dukes had hoped to save the Tsar. Instead, they had merely removed the lightning rod that absorbed the public's anger. With Rasputin gone, there was no one left to blame but Nicholas himself. The stage was now set for the final collapse. The aristocracy had turned on the Tsar. The army was demoralized. And in the working-class districts of the capital, the women standing in line for bread were beginning to talk of revolution. The year 1917 had arrived. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.